After 12 years of relentless dedication, I had turned my father's struggling company into a thriving empire worth $75 million. The years of sacrifice, the sleepless nights, the difficult decisions, all of it had led to this moment. But as I sat at the long, polished dining table in my family's estate, the weight of my father's words hit me like a freight train. "Your brother will take over now," he said, a pleased smile tugging at his lips as his hand rested firmly on Sebastian's shoulder. Sebastian. The younger son, the golden child. The one who had never spent a single night agonizing over profit margins, logistics failures, or boardroom politics. And yet, in my father's mind, he was the rightful heir. I felt the air leave my lungs, but I forced a smile. Years of practice had taught me how to mask pain. Around us, the soft clinking of glasses and murmured conversations continued as if nothing significant had just transpired. This was supposed to be a celebration, a moment to acknowledge the success of Callaway Enterprises. A success that had been my doing. My mother's eyes flicked toward me from across the table, her expression unreadable, but I knew she understood. Unlike my father, she had always seen my efforts. But she wouldn't interfere. She never did. Sebastian gave a modest nod, but I could see the smugness in his posture. He had known. He had been waiting for this. That night, I barely slept. Every moment of the past 12 years replayed in my mind. The contracts I had negotiated, the expansion strategies I had orchestrated, the crises I had solved before they could ever reach my father's ears, and now, I was expected to step aside? To hand over my life's work to someone who had never earned it? No. By 3 a.m., I was in my home office, scanning through documents. I knew Callaway Enterprises better than anyone, better than my father, and certainly better than Sebastian. And what they didn't realize was that while my father had been the public face of the company, and my brother had been busy failing upwards, I had been doing something far more valuable, securing control. By the time the sun rose, I had a plan. At precisely 8:45 a.m., I walked into Callaway Enterprises as I had done every morning for the past 12 years. But today was different. Today, I wasn't walking into my office, I was walking into a battlefield. The whispers had already begun. The employees had heard. Some offered hesitant smiles, while others avoided my gaze altogether. They were waiting to see which way the wind would blow. I ignored them. I had 15 minutes before my father and Sebastian arrived, believing they would walk into their new positions with ease. They were in for a surprise. Sitting at my desk, I pulled up the document that would change everything, the executive shareholders agreement, and then I waited. At exactly 9 a.m., a sharp knock sounded at my door. I didn't respond. The door swung open, and in walked my father and Sebastian, exuding confidence. My father didn't waste time. "Celeste," he said, using his usual commanding tone, "I assume you understand the transition happening today?" "Transition," I repeated slowly, leaning back in my chair. Interesting choice of words. Sebastian's smirk widened. He thought he had already won. My father continued, "Sebastian will be stepping in as CEO. We'll need you to assist with the handover." I arched an eyebrow. "Handover?" I feigned confusion. "Dad, I think you're mistaken about something." His expression flickered with irritation. "Celeste, this isn't up for debate." I smiled then. A slow, knowing smile. "Oh, I know," I said softly. "The thing is, you don't have the authority to make that decision." Sebastian let out a scoff. "Celeste, don't make this difficult. We're trying to do this the easy way." I didn't respond. Instead, I picked up the remote control on my desk and pressed a button. The large screen on my office wall lit up, displaying the document I had been reviewing all night, the Executive Shareholders Agreement, signed 6 years ago. My father's face paled slightly. I turned to Sebastian. "Do you even know what this document is?" He crossed his arms, shifting uncomfortably. "A shareholders agreement?" he guessed. "Correct," I said. "And do you know what it says?" I tapped the screen, highlighting a crucial clause. "This agreement states that any transfer of executive power requires approval from all majority shareholders." I turned to my father. "And I, Dad, hold 60% of the company's shares." Silence. A suffocating silence. Sebastian's confidence faltered. That's impossible, he muttered, stepping forward to examine the document. I leaned forward, my voice smooth and unwavering. Actually, it's very possible. While you were busy failing at every startup you touched, and while Dad was playing the role of business patriarch, I was securing my place. I turned back to my father. Remember when you needed capital for expansion in 2018? You signed over an additional 15% of your shares to me in exchange for my investment. And in 2020, when we faced that lawsuit, another 10% was transferred to me as collateral, which you never reclaimed. I leaned back. That, plus my original 35%, makes me the majority shareholder. Sebastian's face drained of color. You can't do this, he stammered. I pulled out another document. This is the most recent legal filing with the state. Want to verify? Sebastian snatched the paper, scanning it with frantic eyes. Dad, tell her she can't do this, he pleaded, but my father remained silent, because he knew I had outmaneuvered him. And there was nothing he could do about it. Sebastian clutched the document as if he could will the words to change, as if sheer disbelief could rewrite the reality in front of him. But the ink didn't shift. The signatures remained. The legal framework was cleared. I had won. I exhaled slowly, standing up. I'm not firing you, Sebastian, I said, my voice calm, almost sympathetic. I wouldn't want to force you into the real job market. His jaw clenched, his knuckles white around the edges of the paper. But, I continued, you will report to me. You will work under my leadership. And if that's a problem... I gestured to the door. You're free to leave. Sebastian turned to my father, desperate. Dad, say something. For the first time in his life, my father had no answer. He had built Callaway Enterprises from the ground up, but he had underestimated me. He had never believed I would be capable of taking control. That mistake had cost him his company. His face was tight, unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. You're making a mistake, Celeste, he finally said. His voice was calm, measured. A family should stick together. Do you really want to burn this bridge? I met his gaze, unflinching. You burned this bridge the moment you made your decision without me. A heavy silence settled between us. My father had always expected obedience. Compliance. He had assumed I would fall in line, just as I always had, just as my mother always had. He was wrong. My father let out a slow breath, shaking his head in quiet disappointment. Business is bigger than just one person. We can find a solution that works for everyone. I tilted my head slightly, pretending to consider. Oh, I agree, I said smoothly. That's why I'm offering you both a choice. I turned to Sebastian first. You can stay with the company, I said. But not as CEO. You'll take on an advisory role with limited authority. Your salary will be generous, but you will answer to me. Sebastian stiffened, glaring at me with thinly veiled hatred. Or, I continued, you can walk away. I'll buy out your shares at market value. You can take the money and go find a new project to sink your teeth into. My father scoffed. You're acting like you hold all the cards. I smiled. I do. A thick silence followed. I let them sit in it, let them feel what it was like to be powerless. Finally, my father exhaled, rubbing his temple as if this entire conversation had given him a headache. I never thought you'd do this, he muttered. Not to your own family. I felt a sharp pang at his words. Not to your own family. The irony of it all. I wanted to tell him that he was the one who had done this. That he had made the choice to push me aside, to treat me as temporary, but I didn't. Because in the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I wasn't going to let them take what I had built. Not now, not ever. Sebastian was the first to storm out. Good riddance. I knew my brother well enough to predict his next move. He would go to our relatives, our family friends, painting himself as the victim of corporate betrayal. I didn't care. I wasn't here to win their approval. I was here to win my future. My father lingered for a moment longer, as if waiting for me to change my mind. When I didn't, he gave a slow nod. You've changed, he said quietly. I met his gaze, unwavering. No, Dad, I said. I just finally stopped pretending. Then he left, I exhaled, sitting back down in my chair. I should have felt victorious. I had fought for my place and won, but as I stared at the empty doorway, I felt something else, too. A quiet, lingering ache. A part of me had always wanted my father's approval. Some small, desperate part of me had thought that if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself over and over again, he would finally see me. But the truth was, he had never really looked, and now he had no choice but to see me for what I really was, not his daughter. Not his temporary stand-in, the true leader of Callaway Enterprises. I turned back to my computer, my focus shifting. I had spent 12 years building this company, now I would spend the next 12 making it untouchable. Sebastian and my father had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, they were the ones who lost everything. For the first time in 12 years, my office felt quiet. No tense phone calls from my father. No passive-aggressive emails from Sebastian, just silence. But silence didn't mean peace. It meant the battle had just begun. By the next morning, I could already sense the shifting tides within Callaway Enterprises. The atmosphere had changed. Some employees still greeted me with their usual respect. Others hesitated. A few department heads avoided my gaze entirely. They were waiting. Watching, because while I had won the boardroom war, my father and Sebastian weren't going to disappear quietly, and I knew exactly what they were doing. They were working the Whisper Network, reaching out to old family friends, influential board members, top executives. Spreading doubt. Painting me as cold, ruthless, disloyal. Sebastian, in particular, would be playing the wounded son, betrayed by his own sister. I could picture him now, sitting in some high-end restaurant, voice heavy with fake sorrow, telling investors how I had stolen the company. And my father, he didn't need to say much at all, just a heavy sigh, a slow shake of the head, a carefully placed sentence. I only ever wanted what was best for my children. It was calculated and dangerous, because if they managed to turn the board against me, they could push for my removal. They could make my leadership impossible. I wasn't about to let that happen. At 3 p.m., I called an emergency executive meeting. By the time I walked into the boardroom, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Half of the room avoided my gaze. The other half watched me too closely, waiting for me to make a misstep. I took my seat at the head of the table. My seat. Let's not waste time, I said, my voice steady. I know there have been conversations. Behind closed doors. Over drinks. In hushed voices. I let my gaze sweep the room, pausing just long enough on each person to make them shift uncomfortably. I also know that some of you are questioning whether my leadership is sustainable. A few executives tensed. No one spoke. I tapped my fingers against the polished wood. Let's clear that up now. I pressed a button on the screen behind me. Numbers appeared. Data. Facts, cold, undeniable truth. In the last 5 years, under my leadership, this company has grown by 300%. We've expanded into 6 new markets. Increased revenue by nearly $500 million. I turned to the CFO. Paul, do we have a single financial indicator suggesting this company is in trouble under my leadership? Paul hesitated, then shook his head. No. In fact, I continued, projections show another 20% growth next quarter. Silence. So let's be honest about what's happening here. I leaned forward. My father and brother aren't upset because the company is struggling. They aren't upset because I'm failing as a leader. They're upset because they expected me to step aside. To let Sebastian take over, regardless of qualifications, regardless of results. No one argued. Because they knew it was true. Then I dropped the real bombshell. I also know that some of you have been contacted in the last 24 hours, offered incentives to push for my resignation. A few people shifted uncomfortably. I tilted my head slightly. If anyone would like to disclose those conversations now, this is your chance. The silence stretched. Then, after a long pause, one of the senior executives, Robert Langley, cleared his throat. I received a call, he admitted. From your father. He said he was considering making an official appeal to the board. I nodded, unsurprised. And did he offer anything in return for your support? A pause. Then a slow nod. There it is. I exhaled, standing up. My father built this company, I said. I won't discredit that. But I took it further than he ever could have. I let my voice drop slightly. Controlled. Dangerous. And I will not allow him to manipulate it from the outside. I gathered my papers, looking each executive in the eye. If anyone here believes my father and brother deserve control, now is the time to make your move. Silence. No one moved. Good. I turned and walked out, my head high. This wasn't just about keeping my company, this was about making sure they never thought they could take it from me again. That night, I made my own phone call, not to a board member, not to an investor, but to the media. By morning, the business section of every major news outlet had the same headline: Power Shift at Callaway Enterprises. Celeste Callaway outmaneuvers family in boardroom battle. I had made my move, now it was their turn, and I was waiting. The morning after the headlines broke, my inbox exploded. Emails. Missed calls. Messages from journalists, investors, and board members. Some were supportive. Some were cautious, but most of them had the same question: is it true? I let them wait. I knew my father's strategy. He had spent decades crafting a reputation as a shrewd but honorable businessman. He understood that perception held weight in our industry. If he couldn't defeat me in the boardroom, he would try to destroy me in the public eye, and that was exactly what he was attempting. By noon, the first counterattack arrived. The carefully worded press release. Callaway Enterprises has always been a family-run business. We are saddened by recent developments, but remain committed to upholding the values that built this company. Leadership transitions are inevitable, and we hope to move forward with unity and stability. Subtle, but I knew what it really meant. Celeste is reckless. Celeste is unstable. Celeste is not a team player. It was a classic move. Undermine me without direct confrontation. Plant the seeds of doubt. I wasn't surprised. I was, however, pissed. Sitting in my office, I watched as industry analysts debated my leadership on business news networks. Did Celeste Callaway push too hard? Will her aggressive approach hurt the company in the long run? Can she recover from this PR disaster? They talked about me like I wasn't watching. Like I wasn't already preparing my next move, because if my father and Sebastian wanted a public war, I was going to give them one. I didn't release a statement. I didn't call a press conference. Instead, I made one phone call. To an old friend. An investigative journalist. I have something for you, I said. But you'll need to move fast. An hour later, I sent over documents, emails, financial reports, internal records, evidence that Callaway Enterprises, under my father's leadership, had engaged in questionable business practices over the years, ones I had spent the last decade quietly fixing. The story broke within 24 hours. Behind the scenes at Callaway Enterprises, a legacy of hidden debts and financial cover. UPS. The article was brutal. IT praised my leadership for rescuing the company from financial ruin. It exposed my father's mismanagement. And most importantly, it proved that I was the only reason Callaway Enterprises had survived, and just like that, the narrative changed. The board stopped doubting me, the investors stopped hesitating, and my father, he had nowhere to hide. 2 days later, he finally called me. I let the phone ring 3 times before answering. Celeste, he said, his voice tight. We need to talk. I leaned back in my chair. Do we? Silence. Then, finally, a sigh. You didn't have to do that. I let out a soft laugh. Neither did you. He exhaled slowly. This company was supposed to be a legacy. For the family. For both of you. I felt a familiar pang. A tiny, foolish part of me had once wanted that too, but not anymore. Dad, I said quietly. If you wanted me to protect the legacy, you should have trusted me with it. Instead, you tried to take it from me. Another long silence. Then he asked, almost reluctantly, what happens now? I already knew the answer. Now, I made sure they could never touch my company again. The war was over. My father had lost, Sebastian had disappeared, and I had won. But as I sat in my office, staring out over the city skyline, I felt no satisfaction, no thrill of victory, just a quiet, hollow space where something used to be. I had spent 12 years fighting for Callaway Enterprises, building it, protecting it, strengthening it, and yet, the cost of that victory weighed heavier than I had expected, because while I had secured my position, I had lost something else along the way. My family. The next day, I walked into the office as if nothing had changed, but everyone knew the truth. The whispers had stopped, the doubt had faded. I was no longer just Celeste Callaway, the CEO. I was Celeste Callaway, the woman who had outmaneuvered her own father and brother and come out on top. Some respected me for it, some feared me for it, and some still waited for me to fall. I let them wait. At noon, my father and I met in the conference room for what would be our final discussion. He looked older, tired, as if the weight of what had happened had finally settled on his shoulders. I waited for him to speak first. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "I'm retiring," he said simply. "Effective immediately." I didn't react. I had expected this. "I'll sell my remaining shares," he continued. "I'll keep a small percentage as an investor. I won't be involved anymore." I studied him carefully. "And Sebastian?" His jaw tightened. "He's gone," my father admitted. "Took the buyout. He won't be back." A part of me had known it would end this way. Sebastian had never been strong enough to fight his own battles. Once it was clear he had lost, he had done what he always did, run. Still, hearing it out loud made something inside me ache. Not regret, not guilt, just the finality of it all. I nodded. "Understood." My father exhaled, rubbing his temple as if this entire situation had given him a headache. Then, after a long pause, he said something I never expected. "I underestimated you." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing I would ever get, and strangely, I found that I didn't need it anymore. A month later, Callaway Enterprises looked nothing like it had before. The old board members who had sided with my father and Sebastian, gone. The executives who had questioned my leadership, replaced. The company had always been strong under my guidance, but now it was mine. And with that control came a new vision. I introduced initiatives my father had always rejected, modernized systems he had called unnecessary, expanded into industries he had been too cautious to explore. Within 6 months, profits soared. Within a year, we had crossed the $100 million mark, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just fighting to prove myself, I was fighting to build something that no one could ever take from me again. A year after everything had happened, my father and I met for dinner. It was the first time we had spoken since his retirement. He looked different, quieter. He wasn't angry anymore, just accepting. "I read about the latest deal you closed," he said over his drink. "It was a smart move." I smirked slightly. "I know." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. There was no tension between us anymore. No war left to fight. We would never go back to how things were, but maybe that was okay, because I had finally learned something. I had spent my whole life fighting for his approval, and in the end, I didn't need it. I had built something greater than his approval. I had built an empire, and this time, it was mine, only mine.